Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts and comments I have about a film from a very exciting, multi-talented artist and filmmaker from Japan who has been active in the landscape of modern Japanese cinema for many years. His career is, of course, not just as a cinematic artist, but his career also is that of an entertainer, that of a comedian, that of a television commentator. He also has a lot of different artistic outlets, and he is very popular and very famous even now in Japan. The artist is Takeshi Kitano, and he is also known under his stage name as Beat Takeshi, a very fascinating figure who, as I say, is still active and is still very popular in Japan to this very day. His first feature film as a director was in 1989. And my goodness, what an interesting, fascinating work this is. It is called in Japanese, その男、凶暴につき. It is often referred to in English as Violent Cop. And this is the Japanese Blu-ray that I was very fortunate to have been able to obtain a couple years back of this film, Violent Cop, again from 1989. And for those of us who know the production detail history will probably be aware of the fact that initially, according to the production details, Kinji Fukasaku, the very famous Japanese director, was intended to direct this film, but due to scheduling issues, he was unable to, and thus the door was open, if you will, for Takeshi Kitano to sit in the director's chair. And voila, here we have his first feature film as director, called in English Violent Cop, starring Beat Takeshi in the title role, or the main role, as this officer of the law, the violent cop in question, who uses very aggressive and excessive tactics in order to achieve his means or his aims and ends in terms of maintaining law and order. That he certainly goes over the line and over the edge. And we see this time and time again. He has a devil-may-care type of attitude. He seems not to care about the consequences of the actions that we see him carry out. The only place of caring that we get a sense of in terms of his characterization is a relationship that we see in terms of his sister and his own feelings of caring and having to take care of his sister. And that kind of circumstance does play into the essential narrative of the plot when we see the Beat Takeshi character try to confront various criminal elements along the way, including some pretty seedy and nasty drug dealers, and how these circumstances and situations, including that with respect to his sister, come to a head, to a boiling point, to a point of no return perhaps, thus leading to a very violent and inexorable conclusion to this very gritty tale of cops and robbers in essence. This is, I think, the essence of the plot, Violent Cop, or その男、凶暴につき. The film itself is very fascinating because, well, for a lot of reasons, I would say. Its style is, I think, one of the main reasons for this. I think its style is very much, I think, on the surface, very unexpected for what we have in terms of the subject matter, that being a film that involves drug dealers and crime and a certain veiled or nuanced or maybe implied connections with Japanese mafia, corrupt cops, and cops who go above and beyond, and the issues of law and order versus vigilante justice and that sort of thing. And so these, I think, are very much part of this kind of genre, if you will, of gritty action cinematic works. Sometimes we see these sorts of films expressed in other ways. And we see in these sorts of films shootouts that involve a lot of action, that involve a lot of fights and fight choreography and gunplay and this and that. And so that is typically, I think, what we have come to expect from this kind of police cop drama, action thriller type of film. But the style of this particular film, その男凶暴につき, is very different from that, and it seems to go against a certain standard set of expectations when it comes to this type of genre, right? Because the way it's shot is very, I think, unorthodox, and I think quite brilliantly so. The camera oftentimes lingers on for shots. It oftentimes lingers in a way that feels almost poetically unnatural, and I mean that in a very positive way. Action happens in bursts, and all of a sudden the camera stops quite inertly and quietly and quite pensively on a character's face for maybe a moment or two or longer at a time, and it seems to draw out the time in the moment. Also, the way that the editing of this film works feels very abrupt sometimes in terms of ways that expressions of violence explode, but not in a very in-your-face sort of way, but in essence also in a very slow and methodical way, but still is very surprising and cutting. Also, we have the way in which the camera lingers on for what might seem to be almost a stubborn length of time on certain minutiae of police procedural, the sort of stuff that one might otherwise feel would be edited out of any other type of police procedural film like this. In other words, for example, there is a very long extended sequence involving a chase through the streets, car and a person running away from the scene of a crime, and we see this extended all the way out to its very interesting mini climax. And what I really admire about that as an example is the fact that this film is very stubborn in a great way as to what it holds on to and how it presents its information. It goes in a very circuitous route, but it also is very direct in how it's showing this to us. So this is my very long-winded way of saying that I think it is very unorthodox and brilliantly so in the way it's presenting information as a type of police procedural film. Speaking of the way it presents information, it also sets up the notions of antagonist and protagonist in a work of cinema in a very also unorthodox and brilliant way. The way that characters interact with each other seem to be not really dependent on a sense of realism, but rather on a sense of obeying the physics of cinema on the one hand, but doing it in a way that is very much trying, I think, to operate on different motives or different functions. So what do I mean by this? I'll try to be as vague as possible, but the film is not concerned necessarily about maintaining a sense of gritty realism, I would say, and therefore it doesn't concern itself with trying to be faithful to a sense of real-world physical dynamics. Characters instead tend to appear in and out of the cinematic spaces in a way that is very cinematic, and that is not of the real world, but is of the world of cinema. It happens because characters can be placed here and placed there in order, therefore, to further propel the plot forward. And so we're not dealing necessarily with a film that is shot in real time, in real space, but it is purely cinematic space. And as a result, the cinematic space allows for a sense of poetry and a sense of metaphor and a sense of the unreal to act, to stand in for those elements of the story, the antagonist versus the protagonist, the clash, the climax between two forces, and the like. And so this is therefore is a very cinematic environment in which that story plays itself out, and how the filmmaker Kitano chooses to play those story elements out. And the way he chooses to do this is not through any, for lack of a better phrase, conventional route of genre filmmaking. In other words, he doesn't employ a sense of the hero trying to find a way into the bad guy's lair at the end and doing these trying to infiltrate the place, planning a stakeout, and that sort of thing that we might otherwise expect in this sort of genre film. On the contrary, he goes straight forward, and he almost stages his climactic moments and the high violent beats of the film. He almost stages it like a theatrical production, like a theater venue or a play, such that we have something standing in for something else and something else standing in for something else. And rather than play it out in genre terms, he'll just have them there and then just they're there, and then they act out the feelings and the emotions and the convictions that they have being there. It's very much part of a staged theatrical way of presenting information. I find that really fascinating. Another way to put it, we know that Force A and Force B, the good guy and the bad guy, they have to meet at the end. So how are we going to show this? Are we going to show it in a way that where we see them engaged in these sorts of minutia of genre convention that will then lead to the final climax in the villain's lair or something like that? Or let's just have them out, let's just present them in the space the way that Kitano does, and then just have them duke it out in a very Kitano type of way. And I think that leads to some really interesting setups of unconventional confrontational scenes. We see just the suddenness also of violence as it emerges in a way that's very unexpected, because we wouldn't necessarily expect these sorts of setups to suddenly burst into violence. We would intuitively think that there would be steps along the way that would maybe be part of the overall genre narrative convention. Kitano does away with that, and he just goes straight for the jugular, so to speak, and just goes straight forward. And the aggressive quickness with which he goes for these moments, I think, is what makes his films, in particular this film, very startling, very striking, and very unexpected, such as to become very much putting us, I think, off our guard and unbalanced. But I think that's a really fortunate position as a viewer to be in, because it means that it allows for the film to surprise us, and in order to show us different ways of telling a story that might otherwise be something that we would be used to in this genre convention. So that's a very fascinating way in which his style, I think, is already very much apparent. The style, too, I think, in this way of abruptness of action versus also at the same time a very pensive, almost meditative stillness in the way that his camera really locks on to certain close-ups or certain shots of his characters that are still in the frame, motionless in the frame. I think also recalls a lot of the cinematic tactics and style of someone like, say, Robert Bresson or Yasujiro Ozu as well. Speaking of Ozu, what's also very interesting too is how Kitano presents his action scenes in a film like Sono Otoko Kyobo ni Tsuki. There are elements where we actually see the action play out, of course, but also we see the style and the camera employed in a way that almost cuts away from the actual moment of the action itself, such that it's left to us to imagine, or it becomes a sort of ellipsis, if you will, something that is cut out and is abbreviated. And that's a very interesting way to present action. And it also is very reminiscent of another Japanese filmmaker like Ozu, who was often known, especially in his later period films, to focus in on the character rather than the acts that were part of the narrative story. Oftentimes he would cut out those acts and just go straight to the characters talking about a particular act or a particular situation or a particular event. This is often referred to as ellipsis, the abbreviation of narrative flow in order to focus in on other points or other specific parts of the storytelling of the characters. I think Takeshi's work, starting with Sono Otoko Kyobo ni Tsuki, but going further in his filmography, I think does that very well. But at the same time, he also chooses at some points to show us the violence, again in a very interesting and quite brilliantly quirky way, employing a sense of abrupt edits that seem to cut away and cut back in a very beautifully jagged sense that makes it even more compelling when we take it as a whole. So this is to say that there is a lot, I think, of wonderful contradiction in terms of the obliqueness and also in terms of the directness that is at play with this film and Takeshi's work as a whole. And I dare say, too, this kind of balance between different feelings or different poles or different tactics, seemingly contradictory, I think is also in keeping with the way that we see the action set pieces or the narrative milestones in this film play themselves out. As I say, it is a very violent film. It's a very violent film. There's a lot of gruesome, nasty stuff that goes on. But what is so interesting about this and other films by Kitano is the way in which he presents these scenes. There is, of course, this almost this sort of sadistic glee that seems to be in the air when, say, the Beat Takeshi character does what it is he does. We know it's not right, but there is a certain sense of comeuppance, if you will, when we see him do what it is he does. And I think that's also due to the fact that it's starring Beat Takeshi, who is himself a very likable comedian and entertainer, even back then and now. And so he's very likable. He's very funny, and I'm a big fan of him, by the way. So when we see him in this film, in this very morally ambiguous role that he plays, it's still, because he's playing that character, it becomes like something where we, at least I, automatically sympathize with him. I know it's not always right, but it's because of the fact that he is playing the role. And we understand that he is a comedian. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? On the contrary, he uses that comedic edge to such greatness in this film. This film is violent. It is also very, very funny. There are like throwaway quip lines that I think are great. The dialogue is really fresh. Even when the violent scenes happen, there is this innate sense of broad physical slapstick comedy inherent in the scenes of violence as well, which is such an interesting dynamic. Beat Takeshi, as a comedian, as an entertainer, is also he is a what's known in Japanese as an owarai geinin, which is another way to say comedian. And his form of comedy oftentimes involves physical humor and sometimes comedy sketches. And oftentimes in those physical humor comedy sketches, it'll involve maybe other comedians that'll be the comedic foil, if you will. And as a comedic foil, one of the functions or one of the ways to show the comedic foil aspect is to, for the comedian to feign injury, to be what is the butt of the joke. And because of that, he or she feigns injury, pretends to be in pain, is the subject of the comedic attack and the zinger of the joke, and therein lies the essence of the comedy sketch. So even in broad physical comedy, especially in Japanese warai geinin comedy, one of the essences is the idea of a comedian being the butt of the joke, right? And that is shown in a sort of physical, acted out sense of pain or sense of struggle. And that also is a source of sort of relief of comic tension. Here in Sono Otoko Kyobo ni Tsuki, or Violent Cop, a similar type of dynamic, I think, plays itself out. Namely, we have scenes that are very physical, but that feel like a setup of a broad, physical, slapstick comedy sketch. But when they're played out, the consequences are not necessarily directly funny. We don't hear a laugh track in the soundtrack, for example, but we see the camera linger in a way that really identifies the violent consequences of these acts. We see close-ups of bruises, of blood, and that sort of thing. So on the one hand, we understand as viewers that these consequences are very violent and bloody indeed. On the other hand, innately, we do also sense that these setups are, I think, naturally funny, and there is this just a sudden abruptness that is also absurd, and it is itself inherently funny and comedic. There's also the way that setups happen the characters act in a very almost childish, schoolyard type of lowbrow humor, which is also very much in keeping with the owarai geinin comedic entertainer aspect of Beat Takeshi's persona. And then there's also, and that's played out not just in terms of Beat Takeshi's character, but in other characters as well, and the like. And so my point is that it really operates as a film that is a sort of a police crime drama that is also filled with a lot of comedic edge. And I find that combination to be very fascinating and quite almost a surreal and very rewarding viewing experience. And so even now, whenever I watch this film, I'm always very much on edge. And I'm not quite sure how to feel, which I think is a very interesting feeling to have when watching a film, and especially a film like this. So that is to say that I always find this film to be very engaging, and it's one that always brings me back every time I watch it and rewatch it. There are other great elements to it as well. I love the way that the music incorporates Eric Satie in a very iconic way, which I like very much. I also like the performance of Beat Takeshi, Takeshi Kitano. He has a way about him. There's a physicality about him. He seems to be world-weary on the one hand, but he seems to, as I say, to have a devil-may-care attitude. He doesn't give, he doesn't give a darn about anything, it seems. Well, almost anything, right? And then, so we can see that in his body language. One of the things I really love about the performances of my favorite actors in cinema is the way that they walk. I love the iconic walks and the gestures that these actors give to their characters. Toshiro Mifune in the Kurosawa film Yojimbo has a beautiful walk that is also very much like a ballet performer. Henry Fonda in Once Upon a Time in the West has a very Henry Fonda-esque walk, and the way that he sways his hands at the same time is just so ballet-like. Here with Beat Takeshi, the way he moves his body, just the way he walks, there's a way that his character is introduced at the very beginning of the film, that his character just emerges from the depths and walks as the sati music is on in the background, and he's just walking, and we just see him walking. That scene is so cool, and the way that Beat Takeshi carries himself is really iconic. And his almost slouching manner. This has the feeling of being a quote-unquote maybe typical way of it's an everyday Japanese person, an everyday Joe, as it were, on the one hand. But at the same time, it's Beat Takeshi. And so there's something iconic about the almost everyday nature to his physicality, which I find fascinating. It's another beautifully constructed contradiction in this film, with many beautifully constructed contradictions. And so that's one of the things I love about his films, and the like. And so and that's something that we can look forward to if we watch more Beat Takeshi films, or films directed by Takeshi Kitano, and where he features in the roles. We see his physicality and the way he walks, and the way he just seems to either walk or sit down, or he uses stillness in a way that is very beautiful and breathtaking, poetic, but also gives rise to sudden bursts of anger and violence that can come almost out of nowhere. And that's what I think is remarkable about this, and especially as encapsulated in this performance in this very interesting film from 1989. It's called Violent Cop, but its Japanese title is Sono Otoko, Kyoubo ni Tsuki. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time, my dear, dear friends, and cheers.